On December 16, 2024, something shattered the careful composure of Canada's political stage. The Parliamentary Budget Officer released numbers that made economists hold their breath. A $68.5 billion deficit projected for this year, more than double what was promised. Chrystia Freeland, Canada's former finance minister, found herself standing alone in the chamber, facing scrutiny so intense it would define her political legacy in a single afternoon. The data was undeniable, the confrontation was brutal, and the consequences would ripple across the nation. If you're watching this right now, you need to understand what just happened to your country's finances. Subscribe immediately and hit that notification bell because what we're about to break down will change how you see Canada's economic future. Comment below. Are you concerned about Canada's debt crisis? Let's dive into the shocking numbers that sparked this unprecedented parliamentary showdown. The breaking point. Unprecedented deficit projections revealed. 4 years, Canada's government operated under the illusion of fiscal discipline. They promised declining debt-to-GDP ratios, declining deficits, and responsible management of taxpayer money. They created what they called fiscal anchors, promises carved in stone that supposedly guided every spending decision through Parliament. Those anchors were supposed to be unbreakable guarantees to Canadians that their leaders understood the gravity of fiscal responsibility. But anchors, it turned out, were meant to be abandoned when the political winds shifted unexpectedly. In the spring of 2024, the Parliamentary Budget Officer projected a deficit of $50.1 billion for the fiscal year 2024 to 25. It seemed manageable. It seemed contained. It seemed like a number that could fit within the constraints of reasonable fiscal policy. But between spring and the fall of 2024, something fundamental shifted beneath the surface. Trade wars erupted. Tariff threats materialized. The United States under incoming leadership began flexing economic muscle in ways that reverberated across the border. Canada's economic growth projections crumbled. Tax revenues flatlined. Spending categories that were supposed to remain controlled suddenly expanded into commitments the government couldn't walk away from. Then came December 16, 2024, the day everything changed. Chrystia Freeland was scheduled to present the Fall Economic Statement, a routine document that governments use to update Parliament on their fiscal position. Instead of routine, Canada got a shock. The deficit wasn't $50 billion. It wasn't $55 billion. The actual number was $61.9 billion for the fiscal year that had just ended. That represented a $21.8 billion miss from what was promised in the April budget. It meant every fiscal anchor that had been so carefully constructed had already been broken before anyone even realized the damage. But that wasn't the most alarming number. When finance officials looked forward to the coming fiscal year, 2025 to 26, the projections got darker. The deficit was expected to balloon to $68.5 billion. Think about that number for a moment. It's more than double what was projected just months earlier. It represents the largest breakdown in fiscal forecasting Canada has experienced in recent memory. For every Canadian household, that number translates into future tax increases, reduced services, higher interest rates, and diminished economic opportunities for their children. A $68.5 billion deficit doesn't appear in isolation. It creates a cascade of consequences that touch every aspect of economic life. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, in his independent analysis, didn't mince words. He called the situation shocking and unsustainable. He testified to parliamentary committees that this was the first time in 30 years he had seen a projection where federal debt would grow faster than the economy, a fundamental metric of fiscal collapse. Interest costs alone were projected to consume 14 cents of every federal revenue dollar by 2030, nearly double where the country stood before the pandemic. Yet this wasn't a sudden catastrophe that appeared overnight. It was the result of policy decisions made deliberately, one spending commitment after another, each seemingly reasonable in isolation but cumulative in their destructive power. The parliamentary confrontation. When data meets politics. Inside the chamber, the air felt charged with an unusual intensity. Opposition members had been waiting for this moment, the day when they could finally hold the government accountable for the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, rose to his feet with purpose. His voice carried the weight of vindication. He had been warning about runaway spending for months, about government that refused to control its appetite for expenditure, about leaders who spent money they didn't have and asked future generations to pay the bill. When Freeland took her seat to face the questions, the weight of the moment was visible. She had been the first woman ever to serve as Canada's finance minister. She had navigated the complexities of NAFTA renegotiation under the first Trump administration. She had been called the Minister of Everything during the Trudeau years, handling crisis after crisis with a steady composure that had become her trademark. But this afternoon was different. The numbers didn't bend to political rhetoric. The data didn't respond to careful messaging. The deficit was what it was, a testament to a government that had lost control of its spending priorities. The confrontation unfolded along predictable lines on the surface, but with extraordinary tension underneath. Conservative members of Parliament fired questions in rapid succession, each one pointing to a different broken promise, a different failed fiscal anchor, a different gap between what the government said it would do and what it actually did. The NDP, which had propped up the Liberal government through confidence and supply agreements, shifted uncomfortably. They had supported government spending, championed social programs, and backed stimulus measures. Now they faced voters questioning how much of the deficit they bore responsibility for creating. Freeland's responses tried to contextualize the numbers. She pointed to one-time costs, contingent liabilities from settling Indigenous legal claims that had to be booked immediately rather than spread across years. She referenced the unexpected impact of trade tensions with the United States, something no one could have fully anticipated when the budget was prepared months earlier. She reminded Parliament that Canada still maintained a AAA credit rating, that the debt-to-GDP ratio, while rising, remained manageable by international standards, that the government was investing in infrastructure and housing and defense spending that was essential for the country's future. But context doesn't erase numbers. And when you're defending a $21.8 billion miss in a single fiscal year, when the deficit is projected to spike even higher in the coming year, when the Parliamentary Budget Officer is using words like shocking and unsustainable on the public record, context becomes almost irrelevant. The confrontation reached its peak when question after question revealed the same underlying theme. The government had promised one thing and delivered another. It had set fiscal anchors and then abandoned them. It had told Canadians they would maintain declining debt ratios and then presided over deteriorating fiscal metrics. The debate stretched across hours. Freeland remained in her seat, facing the barrage with the composure of someone who had weathered political storms before. But this storm was different. This wasn't about message discipline or clever rebuttals. This was about mathematics that didn't lie. By the time the debate concluded, the political damage was already done. Within days, Freeland would resign from her position as finance minister, a departure that would trigger a cascade of political consequences leading ultimately to the resignation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau himself. The parliamentary confrontation had exposed something fundamental, a government whose fiscal policy had spun beyond their ability to control or even credibly explain. The economic cascade. What these numbers mean for every Canadian. The $68.5 billion deficit doesn't exist in the abstract world of government accounting. It translates into real consequences for real Canadian families living real economic lives. When a government spends $68 billion more than it collects in revenue, that money has to come from somewhere. It comes from borrowing. It comes from selling government bonds to investors, both domestic and international, who purchase those bonds because they believe Canada will eventually repay them with interest. But as the debt grows, as the deficit persists year after year, the risk profile shifts. Investors begin to demand higher interest rates as compensation for the increased risk of lending to the Canadian government. Higher government debt means higher interest rates across the entire economy because investors adjust their expectations based on government risk. A mortgage that might have carried a 5% interest rate becomes 5.5%. For a young couple trying to purchase a $400,000 home, that half percentage point increase means an extra $80,000 in interest paid over the life of the mortgage. Multiply that across millions of Canadians trying to buy homes, and you see how government fiscal irresponsibility translates directly into reduced wealth accumulation for ordinary people. Small businesses face the same pressure. They borrow at rates that reflect the overall risk profile of the Canadian economy. When government debt surges and deficits become uncontrollable, business borrowing costs rise. A small manufacturing firm considering whether to expand operations and hire more workers has to justify the expansion at higher interest rates. What looked like a viable investment at 4% becomes marginal at 5.5%. Hiring decisions don't happen. Workers who would have been trained don't get trained. Economic growth slows. Tax revenue falls further. The deficit expands more. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. For retirees living on fixed incomes, the fiscal crisis creates a different but equally destructive dynamic. As government spending becomes strained by debt service costs, pressure mounts to reform Canada Pension Plan contributions, to adjust old age security eligibility, to means test benefits that were previously considered universal. The social contract, the implicit agreement between citizens and government that you pay into the system during your working years and receive benefits in retirement, becomes subject to renegotiation. Retirees who had built their retirement plans around certain benefit assumptions suddenly face uncertainty. The unemployment rate feels pressure too. When government becomes focused on deficit reduction and debt service, discretionary spending gets cut. A highway maintenance project gets cancelled. A federal office building renovation doesn't proceed. Workers who would have been employed in those projects look for other opportunities. The ripple effects extend to suppliers of materials, to equipment manufacturers, to service providers. Unemployment ticks up. Consumer spending weakens because households become cautious about spending when job security feels threatened. Sales decline at retailers. Those retailers reduce their own hiring. The slowdown spreads. The fiscal collapse also creates international perception issues that most Canadians never hear about directly. When the Parliamentary Budget Officer warns that Canada's debt-to-GDP ratio is rising, when deficits are surging, when fiscal anchors have been abandoned, that information spreads through global financial markets. Rating agencies watch closely. Investors reassess their portfolios. If Moody's or S&P signals even a hint that Canada's AAA credit rating might be at risk, the cost of government borrowing rises immediately. A 0.2% increase in borrowing costs, applied across Canada's $300 billion debt stock, translates into $600 million in additional annual interest payments. Money that has to come from somewhere, usually from cutting programs or raising taxes. For future generations of Canadians, the deficit creates the most insidious burden of all. Every dollar borrowed today is a dollar that must be repaid with interest by taxpayers who haven't even been born yet. A child born in 2024 arrives into a world where per capita government debt is higher, where interest costs consume a larger share of tax revenues, where the government's ability to invest in education, research, and infrastructure is diminished by the need to service past borrowing. That child will live an entire life bearing the consequences of fiscal decisions made by politicians focused on short-term political calculations rather than long-term national sustainability. The deficit becomes a transfer of wealth from young people and future generations to current retirees and government bondholders. The road ahead. Can Canada recover from this fiscal crisis? The path forward requires acknowledging a hard truth that neither the Liberal government under Trudeau nor the subsequent Mark Carney administration wanted to confront directly. Canada cannot spend its way out of this problem. Government spending, by definition, contributes to the deficit. Every new program, every expanded benefit, every infrastructure project funded through borrowing adds to the problem rather than solving it. This doesn't mean all spending is bad. Some spending, particularly on productive assets like infrastructure or education, can generate returns that help service the debt over time. But the scale of Canada's current deficit is so large that even aggressive cuts to spending, paired with tax increases, would take years to stabilize the fiscal situation. The fiscal anchor that Mark Carney's government introduced focuses on balancing the operating budget by 2028 to 29. But operating budget balance, as the Parliamentary Budget Officer emphasized, is a misleading metric if it excludes capital spending. A government that cuts all infrastructure investment while maintaining current spending could technically balance the operating budget while making the long-term fiscal situation worse by failing to invest in future productivity. The challenge is finding cuts that are real rather than accounting tricks. It means confronting mandatory spending on programs like Canada Pension Plan, old age security, and healthcare, which together consume the bulk of federal spending and grow automatically with demographic trends. Some policy voices argue for returning to the growth rates that existed before government expanded spending so dramatically. They point out that Canada's federal operating spending is growing at 9% annually, far faster than the underlying growth of the economy itself. Bringing that spending growth down to 2% annually would require painful discipline across government. It would mean smaller or slower growth in every program. It would mean not fully replacing retiring public servants, accepting that government services are delivered more slowly and less conveniently than in the past. It would mean tough choices about which government functions are essential and which are luxuries that the country can no longer afford. Revenue increases represent the other side of the fiscal equation, though increasing taxes has its own destructive consequences. When government raises income taxes, it reduces the incentive for work effort and investment. When it raises corporate taxes, businesses relocate to lower tax jurisdictions. When it imposes wealth taxes or capital gains taxes, investors adjust their behavior in ways that reduce economic growth. All taxes create deadweight loss. They impose costs on the economy beyond the revenue they raise. The question becomes whether the cost of raising revenue through higher taxes is worth the fiscal adjustment they achieve. Some economists argue that the solution requires structural reforms to how government operates. They point to technology that could automate routine government functions, reducing the need for as many public servants. They suggest consolidating duplicative programs, eliminating government redundancy, and fundamentally rethinking how services are delivered. A federal government that could maintain service levels with substantially fewer employees, they argue, could achieve fiscal balance without devastating cuts to programs or economically harmful tax increases. But these reforms require political will that has been absent in Canadian politics, and they require time to implement, years or even decades, while the deficit continues to accumulate. The Parliamentary Budget Officer's warnings about unsustainability point to a timeline that's running out. In his testimony, he noted that Canada still has more time than some other countries, but the window for gradual adjustment is closing. Every year the deficit persists, the debt stock grows larger, interest costs consume a bigger share of revenues, and the fiscal problem becomes harder to solve. A government that delays tough choices makes the eventual adjustment far more painful. The difference between stabilizing the fiscal situation through gradual, multi-year adjustment versus waiting until a debt crisis forces immediate brutal action is the difference between difficult and catastrophic. What makes the situation particularly challenging is that no political party in Parliament has been willing to articulate the full scope of what fiscal stabilization actually requires. Both the governing Liberals and the opposition Conservatives have offered vague commitments to reduce waste and improve efficiency without specifying what programs would be cut or how much pain Canadians would have to endure. The NDP has resisted any suggestion that social programs should be cut. This political dynamic, where every party wants credit for fiscal responsibility while avoiding actual responsibility for difficult choices, means that Canada continues drifting toward a fiscal reckoning that no one is genuinely preparing the country to face.
The mathematical reality is unforgiving.
Canada's deficit is unsustainable by the Parliamentary Budget Officer's own rigorous analysis. The debt is growing faster than the economy. Interest costs are consuming an increasing share of government revenue. None of these trends reverse without deliberate policy action.